in the car.
Okay, man, okay. I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy. Oh, man. Oh, please, officer. Please, please.
Take a seat.
Please, man. Please. No,
Take a seat.
I can't choke. I can't breathe, officer. Please.
Fine.
My wrist, man. My wrist, man, please. I can't take this, man. I can't. I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm gonna lay on the ground.
Get in the squad.
I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm going down. I'm going down.
Get in the squad.
I'm going down. I'm not going to breathe.
Bro, you like that a heart attack shit, man.
I know I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Talk to the front. Get some more oxygen, bro.
Get on the ground. I'm sick, COVID, man. I can't breathe.
Morning, everybody. Bobby Hesley here, filming my first video back to America from spending 8 months in Thailand. It's good to be back home. So let me get right into it. So, the body cam footage of the arrest of George Floyd was recently released about 48 hours ago. I'm a little bit late to the draw because I've still been adjusting from getting back to overseas, but I did want to give my thoughts on it, put my little spin on the whole thing, my take on everything. There's lots of other great perspectives you can hear out there, so here's mine. So my question is this: why did it take this long for the MPD, for the Minneapolis Police Department, to release this video footage? I smell corruption, and I smell a plan. I smell a political plan that was devised by the powers that be in Minneapolis to suppress this body cam footage. And I'll give you an example of how it should be done. When Rayshard Brooks was killed about 6 weeks ago in Atlanta, the gentleman who tried to steal the taser from cops and shoot them with it, they immediately released the body cam footage of it. Immediately. Literally the morning after we had the body cam footage. Within hours of his slaying, we had that body cam footage. Okay? So why did it take almost 3 months? Almost 3 months for the MPD to release the body cam footage of George Floyd. This country has burned to the ground pretty much. There's so much chaos and destruction and anarchy that has happened in the wake of the death of George Floyd that I believe could have been prevented had we had the context of his arrest. Now let me start off by saying that I in no way am endorsing what happened to George Floyd. That man should still be alive today. I still believe that he was murdered. I still believe that Officer Derek Chauvin should be buried underneath the prison for the rest of his life. I believe that Derek Chauvin is a cold-hearted murderer and that George Floyd was murdered. Nothing will ever change what we saw on that footage. But the fact of the matter is this, and I hate to say it, but it's true. George Floyd played a hand in his own death. I'm not saying that he deserved to die, but if you look at this 8 minutes and 30 seconds, 8 minutes and 38 seconds footage of the body cam of George Floyd, of his arrest, you will see that for an entire 9 minutes before the civilian footage rolled that the world was introduced to, of when he was already down on the ground, he had been resisting arrest repeatedly for almost 9 minutes. And when the murder first occurred, my initial post when I reacted to the death of George Floyd is that most likely he had drugs in his system. I said, we don't know yet. We have to wait for the toxicology report to be released before we know what this man had in his system. But I suspected that he had drugs in his system. My first suspicion was not one of racism. I don't jump to racism every time there's a white on black issue because I believe that that's unchristian. I believe that that's the sin of rash judgment. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we're not supposed to rashly judge and immediately assume the worst about somebody. So my first instinct was not that of racism. My first instinct, based on, the footage that I saw of George Floyd, is that he had a condition known as excited delirium. And I got to give credit to Brandon Tatum. Follow the Officer Tatum on YouTube. Because Brandon Tatum kind of first put me up on this notion of excited delirium. Okay, Brandon Tatum is a former police officer. He knows these things. He's dealt with people that were in similar conditions to Mr. Floyd. And basically what excited delirium is when somebody is on drugs at the time of an arrest, they get on these highly psychoactive drugs that skyrocket their nervous system, but then it plummets almost quicker and almost more dramatic than it raises it. It picks you up and drops you very fiercely. And I'm actually going to read a definition real quick of what excited delirium is. So here's what it says. Excited delirium is a widely accepted entity in forensic pathology and is cited by medical examiners to explain the sudden in-custody death of individuals who are combative and in a highly agitated state. Excited delirium is broadly defined as a state of agitation, excitability, paranoia, aggression, and apparent immunity to pain, often associated with stimulant use and certain psychiatric disorders. So if you go back and watch that footage of the death of George Floyd, you will see in that context, now that we know what he had in his system, he had fentanyl in his system, he had methamphetamine in his system, and I believe one of the reports, because he got two different autopsies, one by the state and another one paid by the actual coroner who did Jeffrey Epstein, who didn't kill himself, by the way. One of the other autopsy reports said that he also had cocaine in his system. Now, again, I have to keep making the disclaimer. It does not mean that Mr. Floyd deserved a death sentence to die by asphyxiation because he was high on drugs. Okay, once a man is in handcuffs, that's a wrap. Once a man has been put in handcuffs, he has been subdued and he has been basically put in custody. He's been rendered neutral. The whole purpose of handcuffs is to make sure that the suspect who's being arrested is not a threat to himself, to others, or to the police. When a man is lying face down in handcuffs, he's not a threat to anybody, himself included. So this is where the evil of Officer Chauvin comes in and still needs to be harshly condemned. Even if George Floyd, I will take it this far, even if George Floyd was on a shooting rampage and he was killing people, okay, let's say he killed 20 people and 17 of them were children, okay, but if he was somehow able to be subdued without the use of lethal force, once he's in those handcuffs, he has a right to live. So it doesn't matter that he was high on drugs. It doesn't matter that he was using counterfeit money. It doesn't even matter that he had weed on him. There's other footage of an angle where you can see that he dropped a white baggie on the ground. But the fact is, George Floyd was murdered. But I feel like the cops used that excessive force, and the courts will determine this, obviously, because George Floyd was a big dude. He was 6'4", 6'5". He was a jacked up dude, and he was amped up on drugs that make you highly anxious, that make you highly paranoid, and that make you extremely aggressive. And if you watch that 8-minute, 38-second footage, which I will link below, you will understand why he ended up on the ground. He actually was the one who put himself on the ground. If you look at the final seconds of that video, he insisted that he be on the ground. He basically torpedoed himself out of the cop car. He wouldn't get in the car. He said that he was claustrophobic, which I don't buy, because he was just in a tiny little Mercedes SUV. I mean, he's a 6'4" dude, and he's in this tiny little Mercedes SUV. It almost reminded me of a clown car. When you see all these clowns get out of this tiny little car, like, man, how did all those people fit in that car? I remember one of the first thoughts I had when I saw the vehicle that Mr. Floyd was driving, that the cops pulled him out of. The first thought I had is, man, how did that big dude get in that little SUV? How did he have any leg room? So this claustrophobic thing, I don't buy. I think he was just fighting to not go to jail. He was resisting arrest, which is typical of many in his situation and in his context when they have drugs in their system. He was just resisting arrest. That's just the bottom line. And when you fight the law wins. We're not supposed to resist arrest. We're not, and it never ends well when we do. So the fact of the matter is, if you watch that video footage, another thing you'll notice is this notion of I can't breathe, which an entire rebellion of a nation was based on. I can't breathe, I can't breathe. You had signs, you had graffiti saying I can't breathe, you had murals, you had paintings, you had marchers chanting I can't breathe, protesters chanting I can't breathe. But what if I told you that Mr. Floyd was saying that he couldn't breathe long before he was in handcuffs, long before he was on the ground face down when the civilian footage started rolling that the whole world saw? He was saying that he couldn't breathe during that entire 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes of when he was resisting arrest. Okay, so that was nothing new. Now, this doesn't justify Chauvin's knee on his neck. We have to realize that those are two separate issues. The fact that Floyd was jacked up on all these psychotic drugs, the fact that he was handcuffed, the fact that he resisted arrest, all of those other things that preceded the footage of Derek Chauvin having his knee on his neck, those are two separate issues. So you have that one issue of everything else, you have the other issue of the knee on Floyd's neck, and that's why Chauvin deserves to spend the rest of his life in jail, and if the state of Minnesota has the death penalty, maybe to get the death penalty. But it's also possible, and I hate to say this, and I hate to predict this, and I will be very disappointed if this happens, but there's also a possibility that Derek Chauvin might even get acquitted. I'd be crushed if that happens. And I'm not going to go burn my own community down to the ground and shoot off duty, police officers over TVs. I'm not going to do any of that crazy stuff. But I'll be devastated if Chauvin gets acquitted over this. I really would. And why did it take so long for this body cam footage to be released? That's what stinks to me. And that's really the point of this video, folks, is everything that could have been prevented in this country from happening. As a matter of fact, I got a little litany of things that could have been prevented from happening. Think about this. You had Minneapolis burned down to the ground. They estimate that there was over $500 million worth of damage that was done in the city of Minneapolis within a 10 to 14 day period. $500 million to poor black communities, businesses that are probably never going to come back, schools that may never come back, a police station that may never come back, because the police station that Chauvin worked at was burned down to the ground. So there are so many things in that community that may never come back, that had they have just released that body cam footage immediately, like they did in the case of Rayshard Brooks, because you would think that the cops would want to look out for their own. You would think that the cops would want to provide as much evidence for justification for their actions as they could, as quick as they could. But that evidence was purposely suppressed. And look at everything that happened because of that. You got Minneapolis burned to the ground, okay? You got the Minneapolis Police Department that's been defunded and disbanded. You have other police departments around the nation that have also been defunded, like in New York and even in Michigan where I live. You got Governor Whitmer, I think she trimmed $15 million from various police departments. Now, who is that going to hurt? I want you to think about this for a second. Who is that going to hurt? It's going to hurt poor black people that live in minority communities. Why? Because they're the ones who need the police the most. They're the ones who need the most protection. Where there's crime and poverty and blight, that's where the cops are needed most, because that's where the most crime and dysfunction occurs. And those are the ones that are going to get hit the hardest by all these defunding bills. So you got all these police departments that are being stripped of their funds. You had all the damage. You got all these riots that happened all across the country. They weren't protests, they were riots. Okay? You got police and civilians that have been killed. Innocent cops, like Officer David Dorn and 4 other police officers that were murdered. You have all these other civilians that have been murdered, children that have been murdered, that have been caught up in these riots, like Sequoia Turner down in Atlanta that was caught in crossfire between Black Lives Matter activists and other radicals. 8 years old, she got her life taken away from her. You got national monuments being destroyed. One of which was Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves, who black people owe an unpayable debt to, because he established the Republican Party to abolish slavery, and his monuments are being destroyed over some footage that wouldn't have been released. You got Uncle Ben, you got Aunt Jemima, the Washington Redskins, all these cultural icons that are success stories of minorities, of put upon minorities, that were able to make it in the corporate world, that were able to become corporate and cultural icons in spite of the paltry beginnings that they were given, in spite of all the hardships that they had to endure, in spite of all the obstacles they had to overcome to become that success story that made them such a success story that they end up on our pancake boxes and our syrup bottles and on our team logos. All those people are gone now because of all this wokeness that's sweeping through the country, all this social justice warrior wokeness, all these woke white liberals that are basically burning the books of history that shouldn't be burned, that are part of our cultural heritage. The thing that's most devastating is we have this unprecedented spread of Marxist communism throughout our country. with Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And I've done plenty of content on those for you to know where I'm coming from on that, about how deeply Marxist those organizations are. And now they have an influence that I believe is here to stay. Black Lives Matter has raised over $1 billion in the wake of George Floyd's death. They raised almost $100 million within the first week of when he died. And yet they haven't sent a dime to the Floyd family. If George Floyd, Black Lives Matter really mattered to Black Lives Matter, why wouldn't they break him off $1 million? Break off the Floyd family $1 million. Pay for his funeral. Foot the bill for that golden casket that he was in. Pay for the 3 funerals that he was in. Those didn't look very cheap, by the way. I mean, even if they gave him $10 million, $100 million would still be nothing. Yet not a dime of all that money that they raised off this dead black man went to his family. That shows you how much that for-profit corporation really cares about black lives. They're not a 501c3. They're a for-profit corporation, and they're raking it in off of these dead black men. Because if your Black Lives Matter, the organization, a good black man is a dead black man. That's who brings in the money for them. And then you have other groups like Antifa that are leading the movement, that are killing police officers. If you ever see graffiti anywhere in these cities that say ACAB, ACAB, that means all cops are bastards. That's what that stands for. All cops are bastards. Black people don't talk like that. Black people don't use the word bastard. We don't say all cops are bastards. Those are liberal white commies that talk like that. And those groups have arisen in the wake of George Floyd, and that could have been prevented had they released this footage like they should have. But I believe they had a deeper political agenda for suppressing that footage. You got all this hatred of the police that came as a result of that. But the thing that saddens me the most, I mean, they all sadden me equally, I guess. I shouldn't say the most. But the thing that really saddens me, and I saved this for last, is just the racial division that the death of George Floyd has caused in this country. And it's not even so much the death of George Floyd that's caused this racial division. It's the spin that the media and the left and certain aspects of government have put on this that's caused such a deep racial division, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1960s. And that's a shame, because we have come so far. All the work of Dr. King and the Freedom Riders and all the anti-segregationists that they did in the 50s and the 60s, all that work, I feel, has been coming undone since the death of George Floyd. We've been moving backwards when it comes to race in this country. We really have. And there's almost like, and I'll do a new video on this because I'm already running over pretty hard here, but I almost feels like there's an era of black supremacy. There's a black supremacy movement that is sweeping throughout the United States. That if you don't toe the line, and if you don't fall in place and jump on the Black Lives Matter bandwagon, whether it's the organization or the slogan, if you say anything contrary to that, you get canceled. You lose your job. There's even people that have been killed because they said the slightest thing against Black Lives Matter. And that's a shame. And all of that could have been prevented had they released this body cam footage ASAP to give us more context. And I'm going to close this video with a saying that says that the greatest lies are told in silence. We're deceived more by what we're not told, by what we don't know, than by what we do know. Not all forms of deception are active. In fact, some of the most sinister forms of deception, some of the most destructive forms of deception, is deception through omission. Things that are not disclosed, things that are not revealed, things that are not told. That had we have known those things, everything would have been completely different. It's called deception through omission. It's a form of fraud. You're withholding material information that the other party, i.e. the United States of America, has a right to. We had a right to that footage. We had a right to know what led up to George Floyd being down on the ground, stomach down, with handcuffs behind his back, with an officer's knee on his neck. We all had a right to that. The whole world had a right to know why that happened. And just now, almost 3 months later, they're finally releasing the footage. And even the footage they released is incomplete. Even the footage that they released cuts off at a very crucial moment, I think. Right at the 8-minute, 38-second mark, that's when it really started getting hot. But I believe they cut it off right when Chauvin showed up, because I'm sure, and maybe this will come out in court, but I wouldn't be surprised if Chauvin was caught on tape saying some damning things to his case and some damning things to the police department. And maybe that's why they cut it off. But we have a right to see that too, and we demand to see it. So I don't enjoy making these videos, guys. If it were up to me, I'd be talking about superheroes and Catholic theology and pop culture stuff. But everybody's talking about these hot button racial issues because that's what's sweeping the nation right now. And honestly, I didn't plan on really making any videos for the next few weeks because I'm getting my home studio together to launch the Bobby Hesley Show. But I had to make this one. I thought I was done making these walking videos, but I guess I'm not, because my conscience won't let me stay quiet on this. So sound off in the comments below, guys. What do you think? Do you feel that if this footage was released sooner, the way the Rayshard Brooks footage was released, and I also did a video on Rayshard Brooks, if you want to go to my channel, you can watch my spin on that. I feel like it's very parallel in a lot of ways to what I'm talking about here in this video when it comes to why you should never, ever resist arrest. It never ends well for you when you resist arrest, ever. I fought the law, and the law won. The law is going to win every time, folks. And sometimes they win lethally. Sometimes you don't come back from a defeat at the hands of law enforcement. And that was the sad case with Rayshard Brooks and with our brother George Floyd. So, that's my take on it, guys. Subscribe to my channel, like this video, share it, spread it far and wide, and I will see you on the next video. It's good to be home. God bless.